episode coming to the foundation. And so, Martine, this is your first one, right? Jen, is this your first one? Okay, so how we've been doing this is essentially like this. And Jim will go through whatever chronology that he has planned out, and we can interrupt Jim, we can ask Jim, we can take him off course, we can take him off tangent, we can take him back to the 1700s, or well, probably not this installment.
Did that already.
So what we're going to do first, though, is just so it's not just Jim on this, we're going to go around and people are going to just briefly introduce themselves so we can see who's in the room. And we're starting this way.
Hi, I'm Jen.
And your relation to this whole thing?
I'm the Executive Director of the Illinois Disciples Foundation.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Aaron. I'm the Assistant Director.
And I tried to do myself last time with some wacky flip the thing around. I don't know how well that works, so we'll skip me for right now.
Hi, I'm Amy. I'm a student.
I'm Martine, and I'm on the board of the foundation.
I'm Joe. I'm also on the board of the foundation.
And I'm Jeff, and that's my hand. And I'm running the camera, and I'm the board. All right. And we're still in the territory where none of us can actually refute anything Jim says because none of us were here in 1963. That comes later when we can
Start challenging.
All right. And I gave back. Did you bring any props this time, Jim?
Yes.
Okay. Because last time we used props, which I thought I could photograph and insert later on, but I ended up not being able to, so I scanned them. The photos turned out super shitty. So, but when I actually put this all together, we'll have some. Won't just be talking heads and stuff. All right, so take it away, Jim.
Well, I arrived in 1953.
63.
63, excuse me.
Can't correct you already.
August 1. It was a bit of a struggle to make the decision to come out here, which we went over last time, I think. But a rehash won't hurt, at least get me started. And some of the props I brought have to do with the literature that passed between here and there in Youngstown, Ohio. I had made a commitment to the church in Youngstown to hang around there for quite a while. So when Jack Jarman, who was the pastor of Uniplace, and because he was the pastor, also served as the president of the foundation, called and wanted to know if I would consider coming out here. And I told him no because of the commitments that I had. The next thing happened was that he wrote a letter to the pastor of the church there in Youngstown and wanted to know if that was a contract agreement. And the pastor there, it wasn't. So he said it wasn't, and he thought that I should at least come out and look at it. So about a month after that, I got another letter from Jarman, and in the meantime, I had talked with Dr. Beach, who was the pastor there in Youngstown. So I decided that it would be good to come out and at least look. So I came out and looked on the 1st of May, which was a bad time because it had snowed about 6 inches that weekend, and it was cold as it could be. But we met with all of the board and individual people separately, stayed all night with the chairman of the board, had interviews the next day, interviews the third day, and then we left.
Now, at 63, was this building done yet?
Yeah, everything was done except chapel was not done. A lot of the furniture was not here.
So it wasn't really inhabited, it was just finished?
Yeah, it was, the insides and the outsides were finished, like the tile was on the ceiling. But I don't think there was much else in this room at that time. So it was an interesting interview, and as Dolores and I went back, we talked, and at that point we weren't sold. I got in touch with Indianapolis, the guy who was in charge of campus ministry, and he advised us not to take it because his name was Bob Huber. Bob was probably one of the leading lights in campus ministry at that time, and he had gotten the job at the national level as a result of his work on local campuses. And he knew this situation pretty well. He certainly knew it better than I did. The foundation had always, up to that moment, been under the thumb of University Place Church. Most of the money that came to the foundation came through the congregation. So the foundation felt obligated to do what the congregation wanted it to do. And its primary objective at that time was to create or reproduce church leaders, people who would leave here, who would graduate from here and go somewhere else and become a leader in some church somewhere, some congregation somewhere. So Uniplace had tooled itself up to be a model congregation so that everybody who was being trained would get the best training possible in the local congregation. And they were doing a darn good job of it. Dr. Jarman was probably the best pastor this denomination ever had, actually. But sometime in the 50s, well, the foundation at that time was a national agency. It was not like it is now. It received a big chunk of its money from Indianapolis, which amount equaled what the congregation was doing. So that gave it, there was an equalizer effect going on. And that opened a little gate that I used later. But because of those relationships, Bob had come to know this outfit pretty well. And his advice was, look, if you go there, you're going to be under the thumb of that congregation. And even though Jack Jarman is a pretty liberal guy, he's going to have to do whatever the congregation tells him. So they're talking about an ecumenical ministry, but it's not going to be a united ministry.
And the distinction for you between those two is what? Ecumenical versus united.
This forces me to go back a little bit.
Okay, that's okay.
About 1950, 51, the World Council of Churches, well, I need to go back even further. The World Student Christian Federation was created a little bit before the Depression. And it was heavily influenced by the socialist movement in Europe and in the United States. Most of its members were coming out of low-income families and were aggressive enough to become leaders in their local communities and regions, and then became known throughout the world. And they had coalesced and formed the World Student Christian Federation. One of its first tasks had been to send members from various and sundry places around the world into Europe to see what the heck was going on under Hitler in Germany. And they all came back with negative critique of what was going on. And they began to move around on campuses because that was the only place they were going to get an audience, and spoke out about what they saw. And Bob had been involved in that. So he had seen what a united front what a united group or movement would be able to achieve, at least in campus ministry. But he was not able to see that congregations nor denominations throughout the United States were paying much attention to this. And I guess Uni Place was one of those places that was not paying much attention to it. What Bob understood was that, from that, was that denominationalism, as it had come to be known in the 30s and 40s, was in his opinion a dead duck. So that was the background for his reason for saying don't go there. What he saw as an ecumenical movement here would be that of a federation. But a federation may have a centralized kind of a voice, but the real powers are in the separate units that make up that federation. So he didn't see any future in that. And we had several long conversations about it. I even went over to Indianapolis and sat down and talked with him for a long time. But the more he talked about it, the more it seemed like it was at least a challenge. So I promised him that I would change things. Done me. And Jack Jarman was an interesting, charismatic person. And that was also appealing. And some of the students that I met at the interview were interesting. And some of the questions that were asked during the interviews were interesting, especially about civil rights and racism.
And how old were you at this point in '63?
I'm back to 63.
Yeah, but how old were you?
How old was I? 20, 27.
So you're not a large amount older. I mean, so the students are 18.
No, there were just a few years between me and undergraduates, and graduate students hardly any difference.
Can I, one question? You probably answered this before the last time, but how is it that they found out about you over there in Youngstown?
One pastor at Youngstown named Al Pennybacker was pastor of a suburban church, and he was one of the folk that worked closely with the Mahoning Area Council of Churches, which was located right across, its offices were located right across the street from the church that I served. And I got to know him there, well, he knew me. So he had been talking with Jack. They had been working, trying to find somebody for 4 years to take this position. And so Jack was moaning about having a hard time, and he said, well, why don't you call Jim? So that was his recommendation to Jack about me. And Jack didn't have anything else to look for. So he did, he called.
And how big was the denomination at that point?
The disciples?
I mean, not denomination, the congregation here.
Here? I would guess it was around 800. Not all of them attended, of course.
Right.
About when we first came, there were 400 in Sunday morning services. Sunday morning is the big thing for congregations. Everything during the week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, moves towards Sunday because Sunday is the big event. And it takes a lot of work to get ready for Sunday. So when you get 400 people showing up, that means a lot of stuff is going on during the week.
And what do they have now?
I don't know.
I know it's under 100.
Average around 100 or less on attendance.
How many does that hold in there?
The sanctuary, there are enough seats in it, or were enough seats in it to hold 600.
Okay.
And there were lots of Sundays in which it was full.
One other question. And at that point, when you were looking at this possibility, what kind of, were there any things that were not directly connected at the foundation, that were not directly connected or driven by the congregation people?
Yes. Which gets us back to the unification thing. In the early 50s, the World Council of Churches held its first World Assembly in Evanston, Illinois. John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State, was at that assembly and endeavored very hard to get it to adopt an anti-communist position, and especially an anti-Soviet position. It refused to do that. And as a result of that, denominations who had created, to some degree, the World Council of Churches, then had to take positions with regard to that. Most chose to be neutral. Not all tried to be neutral. The one outfit where that was not the case was in campus ministry. And over that decade of the 50s, an outfit called the United Christian Fellowship was created in 1961. And the campus ministries on this campus, whose denominations had helped bring those groups together, also decided to create a local campus chapter of the United Christian Fellowship. IDF was one of those, McKinley was one, Wesley was one, United Church was one, the Community United Church, and the University Baptist, those five. And it had been in existence for about 6 months. Well, in January of '63 was when it came into formal existence. And so I got to meet those folk. There were 13 staff people, and we would be a team that would be answerable to the UCF board, not to the separate entities that made up UCF, although that was a bit greasy kind of relationship.
So Jarman had led the IDF into that?
Yeah. Well, Jack was a committed ecumenist, so that's what he wanted to do. The other thing that had happened during the 50s was, and I brought the Constitution that I had to work with. 27 board members, IDF board members, came from various districts throughout the state of Illinois. And then 18 people who had to live within 30 miles of this building were elected. So
18 as part of the 27 or 18 plus
no,
27?
in addition to the 27. So we had a board of 40 some odd, whatever that figures out to, 40 some odd people. And
Now we just have odd people.
yes. But this meant that Jack had to, which I had to do too, that means you had to have a finger in each one of the 27 districts and to be nurturing people who would say yes to being on the board. And you had to do that every year.
Was that for funding purposes? Was
No, that was just get them here. at a
No,
board meeting.
but to get them on the board, to have people from these different regions, was
Oh,
that?
it would help funding, but funding was not dependent on it.
Then what was the motive for it?
That was the way the board was set up. That's all I can tell you.
But was the motive to be, was that, so it could be truly an Illinois Disciples Foundation?
IDF was a national organization.
As opposed
at
to
that
the
time, and
Champaign-Urbana.
It looked good on people's dossiers.
So as when you say national organization,
We were kind of an auxiliary of Indianapolis,
okay.
Of the general church, what is now the general.
the general church.
So it was more of an Illinois Disciples Foundation as opposed to the
Yes.
Champaign Disciples
Yes,
Foundation?
yes, that's how it got its name.
Okay.
Well, Jack, as I learned too, that's an impossible job. You can't, at least I found it, you can't do that job and do campus ministry. You can do campus ministry, but you can't do that job. So that's one of the push and pulls. And Jack had decided that he couldn't do that anymore. That the pastor of University Place Church, who had 800 members, who had all this heavy stuff they had to do every week to get ready for Sunday, just was not able to do that anymore. So, and I brought that document too. The board had decided that they wanted an executive director and a campus minister. I guess on the theory that one single person could be split in half, and one could do the 27 districts, and one half could do the other. Of course, they didn't outline that when I was being interviewed. No one said anything about that kind of detail.
When you were
Well, it
being,
doesn't- I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
It doesn't sound like they had even figured it out for themselves.
I
that
don't
this
think
was
so
what
either.
they
I
wanted to
don't
do.
think so either.
Okay.
And because they hadn't figured that out, it was easy to do a lot of things that if they had figured it out, it would not have been so easy to do. So, so there was enough ambiguity here that I was able to do a lot of stuff that otherwise would have been possible.
so you just described, I guess, the structure of the foundation when you came. And you had mentioned that what the foundation was doing was trying to produce pastors at that
Right.
point. But what else? What other kind of programs were happening at that time?
The one that they talked about the most, which was intriguing to me at the time of the interviews, was their demonstrations on Sundays in front of all of the Green Street merchants about their failure to service people of color.
Now, was this part of UCF or was this was this
That was
IDF?
part of IDF. Robert Lenz, who was the student advisor, had organized that. Esther Ewall, who was one of the board members, was a real firebrand. Harry Tebow, who was a professor of philosophy, was kind of the front person. Harry was also chair of the Democratic Party in the county, and so attracted a lot of attention. And so people turned out for those things. It wasn't just people from here, from the foundation, but people very broad throughout the campus turned out for these things.
And the denomination at that point, what did the congregation think of that?
Well, all I can tell you about that is what Harry Tebow passed on to me. One day he was approached by Jack Jarman and was informed that the congregation, Harry was a member of Uni Place at that time, was told by Jack that the congregation was not happy with this particular program and that they were going to cut off funding for the foundation and as long as Harry was there, so Harry left.
But there was already a right-left split happening
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
between the foundation and the church.
Yeah, right. Yeah, everybody on the board, I would have to classify as a moderate or to liberal type person in their views. There were no leftists, for sure, and there were some conservative members. But they were all fair and open people.
What about relations with the communities in the North End and stuff at this point? Well, how did the congregation and the foundation differ, or how were they similar in how they relate? And again, this is early on. I want to try to
Yeah.
keep it in this early stage here.
Well, again, all I can say is what was passed on to me. John Lee Johnson and Charlie Guerin both related this story about how the pastor of Uni Place back in the 30s pulled off some kind of event in which the black community interpreted as anti-black. And so they had a very negative, both Charlie and John Lee had learned this from their parents, or from somebody. And so their attitude towards Uniplace was negative. They both, underneath here, the food court, that was a recreation room. And there were 2 pool tables and a ping pong table in there. And so that's how I first met John Lee and Charlie were playing pool downstairs. They'd come in, stay around a couple of hours, and we'd talk, play pool. We had 2 board members who were professional pool players, and they would teach people how to play pool. So there were just a lot of people who would come here and play pool. And so I would say that the relationship of those folk towards the foundation was good, because once I guess it was when Malcolm X was shot, a number of campus ministries were set on fire, allegedly by black marauding groups. And IDF is the first white institution you reach going towards campus, and we were never hit. I don't know why, but we weren't. So I think our relationship at that stage was okay.
Well, at that point that John Lee and Charles Guerin were hanging out here, the IDF was already helping out and
Yeah.
doing civil rights stuff.
Right.
So that,
The protests that were on Green Street, were they mainly white people or mainly congregational people, or was it,
For all kinds of folk.
okay.
There weren't very many blacks here on campus at that time, so I don't think there were too many black faces, but I would judge from descriptions that were given that it was mostly white folk from the various and sundry institutions that Harry and others, Esther and Bob, were able to pull in. Bob was also president of the student president of the YMCA, so he was able to bring people in from the Y.
another establishing question. So the congregation, so there's 800 people in the congregation. I know this is right as you're coming in, but where were they pulled from? So I'm assuming they're mostly white, but are they mostly professors and their families? Are they some of the elites? Are they a mixture of what was it at that point?
There was always a lot of talk at Uniplace meetings about the town and gown issues. And it seemed to me that the membership was largely town as opposed to faculty types. I never did really try to do a statistical thing, but my guess is that there might have been 80 solely university types, students and faculty.
So that would be a big minority then at that point.
Yeah, and I say that because most of those 80 came through the foundation board at some point, because that was the only place I would go to get people. Anyway, where are we?
Well,
63.
You've arrived.
I've arrived.
Right, you've arrived, and so.
You're wrangling the Constitution.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I decided I'd take the first 6 months and just try to figure out what was going on and learn as much about the history of this place as possible, and put program energy into doing UCF stuff. They had bought a house over on the corner of Pennsylvania and Lincoln, which still stands. They had bought that UCF had, because the Illinois, or the Pennsylvania Avenue Residence Hall had just been built. And the theory was a campus chapel right across the street from Pennsylvania Avenue would be able to work with the housing unit.
Is that a frat now?
Isn't that farmhouse frat?
No, that's a dorm.
No,
It's-
but the UCF
Oh,
building.
the house?
Yeah.
No, that's on the other corner.
Oh, okay.
It's the house
I
on
was gonna say, that's
the,
interesting.
it's the house on the south, east corner, Pennsylvania and Lincoln.
No, that is farmhouse.
Southeast corner.
It must
That
be
is a
northeast
frat.
corner.
That's the farmhouse frat.
No?
No, farmhouse is
Oh,
a
excuse
block
me,
up.
northeast
Northeast.
corner.
Northeast corner,
Northeast
Oh,
okay.
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 Yeah, northeast.
Okay.
Right across from the Grove.
Right. So, a lot of programming began to develop there. And we had Richard Feldman, who had been the UCC campus minister. He became the director of that facility. And the rest of us, he would give us tasks to perform, and we would do those tasks. And then on a broader scale, we had an educational program going. And this was to bring some left-of-center theology to the campus. And since I just recently graduated from seminary, the youngest one, that sort of became my task. So I started out offering a course on the thought of Albert Camus for the first semester, which was kind of an introduction to existentialism. Another task was to charter buses and recruit people to go to the march in Washington, March 28 or 29, whatever the date was. Martin Luther King gave his I Got a Dream speech. So, and UCF institutions helped. That was a fairly easy task because we had 5 institutions to pull from. And they were all liberal institutions. They were all, those denominations are all involved in the civil rights movement. So it was no trick to get those buses filled.
Did you go along on that?
No,
time?
no. I had to start teaching class, and I hadn't done any of the homework yet, so like you, I was
Gee, that sounds
scrambling.
familiar.
After the buses left, I was scrambling to get ready for the course. Everybody came back all fired up, although there were some who had heard Malcolm X's comments about the I Have a Dream speech, and Malcolm had interpreted it. Yeah, it was that Martin Luther King has a dream, but it's a nightmare. So we had this interesting tension over that event. And one of the things that UCF wanted to do was to start getting ready for Summer '64, which was registering black voters in Mississippi. And a bunch of us, I shouldn't say a bunch, there were about a carload of us, 6 people went over to Elkhorn University in Elkhorn, Indiana, to be trained in nonviolent tactics, and also how to register people. So came back and started doing that, recruiting people for that. And in the meantime, I discovered that I was responsible for putting together for the national office budget projections for 3 years out. And so I had to figure out how to do that. Fortunately, Glenn Lacey, who was head of that unit in Indianapolis, knew that I was new on the job, so he came over one day and spent a whole day with me and helped me figure out how to budget 3 years out, and how to produce the statistics to back up your request, which was an interesting process in and of itself. Then you had to go to Indianapolis and meet with all of these folk and present your cause as they presented their cause. So at this point, I got acquainted with all of the big wheels in the denomination, presidents of universities, presidents of associations of churches that had pooled together, like Missouri, Texas. And these were very powerful people, and they would squash you if you gave them any reason to. So you had to be careful around them. And Bob Huber was involved in that process too, and he was getting squashed pretty hard because he was demanding more money for campus ministry all over the country. So the issue became, okay, what other campus ministers are here besides Bob Huber? There weren't any. I was it. So Bob and I had to take on this. I mean, you're talking about 300 or 400 people who control budgets of millions of dollars and having to do battle with them. And
So, just, why weren't there other campus ministers involved in that?
Because the move towards UCF had eliminated all separate units as they merged themselves.
Okay,
The only place where that had not happened was here at the U of I.
I see.
Like McKinley stood on its own, Wesley stood on its own, University Baptist had to stand on its, UCC had to stand on its own legs in those arenas. So nationwide, we became known as the unique campus ministries in the state, or in the U.S., because we had not merged. Federation was not enough.
So just a clarification for me. You are the first executive director then of the foundation, right? So once Jarman decided he needed somebody else to take this over,
Yeah.
you basically had to start everything from scratch.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And was there an endowment at this point or not?
There was a small one, yes.
Kind of like now.
Well, hopefully not.
Yeah, we're starting all over again.
Hopefully not. Anyway, Bob lost his job as a result of these struggles. Part of the reason was, beginning of the 60s, the denomination decided to call the 60s the decade of decision. Now, why, I do not remember, except it was a very exciting idea, that things were going to change. That was the basic idea. This was the decade in which decisions were going to be made, which would change everything. And one of the thing that Indianapolis had on mind was that we were not considered a church at that time.
Meaning?
The denomination.
The denomination.
The denomination was not considered a church at that time.
I'm gonna have to ask when is the denomination not a church? Is this some kind of Zen riddle?
I think
When
so.
when it become a church, or what did it?
We were
What-
known as, among ourselves, we were known as a brotherhood. But there were people who were opposed to being a denomination.
Disciples of Christ, people who were opposed to it? Well, before.
Well, you know, the disciples were created in 1830-something to bring all churches together into one.
Right.
So there was part of that dynamic was that, well, we're against
You're not a church.
denominations. So,
Pre-party formation.
right, kind of thing.
Okay.
So, anyway, we were not considered to be a denomination, but the World Council of Churches had been created in the meantime. And the only outfits that could belong to the World Council of Churches were denominations. So the disciples had to figure out how to become a denomination. And that was a part of the decade of decision. They were going to make that decision. Well, that was good for us, because there was no way that after Bob was fired, there was no way that I could deal with this massive group of wealthy administrators. And they had already decided that campus ministry was going to be, was no no longer gonna be lodged at the national level. It was gonna be lodged somewhere else. So the question was, where is it going to be lodged? Well, the first answer was, well, in UCF. That was the obvious one.
So UCF was a nationwide movement, it wasn't
Yeah,
just
it was
a
a
campus-wide.
Right,
So
right.
the manifestation of it here was just a reflection of a larger thing going on.
Right, right.
But it was only with campus ministries, right, not with congregations? Or it was with, did congregations as well, like, merge into?
No, congregations were not a part of it at that point.
Okay.
One question before, why was it that the foundations here did not basically sort of, by becoming part of UCF, sort of dissolve? Like you mentioned in other places, there were no campus ministries because they became part of that UCF and there was no separate foundation type things.
Well, I think it's because of the ideology of a united Christian fellowship, and the idealism that surrounded that, without much thought given to what did that mean on the ground. At the end of summer '64, Larry Hill and I were fed up with what we were having to put up with just on that point. Larry Hill was based in McKinley, and McKinley had given him as a gift to UCF.
Given him?
But
He was the gift.
Larry, you were the gift.
Larry was the gift.
Tied up, stuffed off on their front porch.
And as it worked out, that was also true of me and everybody else. And what we were discovering was that these gifts were wrapped with ribbon that still had a string there. And when you were doing something that they didn't like, you got yanked. So Larry and I made enough noise that we were granted permission to write papers on how this could change. How could we change this situation? So we produced a proposal and presented it, and the proposal was that the 5 separate foundations would be merged in 1968. And everybody said yes. That is, everybody in those foundations said yes. Unfortunately, the congregations that were attached to those foundations remained silent, let's say. So we began to work on resolving that issue. We hired, first thing we decided we needed a boss. We needed one person that would be accountable to all of the separate boards, and then to whom all the staff would be accountable. So we hired Howard Dolphinbook to be our executive director. Howard came out of Tulane University, so a United Methodist guy, and he was really great. It was fun working with him. He was ahead of most developments that were going on campus a few months. So we were able to anticipate a lot of things. And Howard was, while he was our executive director, he was sort of the equal among equals. And everybody got along with him pretty well, I think. So, but by '68, the University Baptists had gotten enough flack from their congregation that they announced that they were not going to be able to do this. So they withdrew.
Could, reasoning, did they justify it at all? Or? What kind of flack were they getting? What was the fact that they were getting pulled away from the congregation? Or?
I think that's the case, yeah.
Okay.
And money was attached to that. So as distance was created between them and the congregation over there, why the congregation said, you've got to come back, or
I don't know if I remember this from a different session of this or from a different discussion we had. But going back to Martine's question, I thought one of the differences of Champaign Urbana than some other places where UCF more successfully happened was that the foundations had buildings here, and some of the places they didn't have
Right.
the buildings, so it was much easier if you're just a congregation with an office that was the foundation. It was easier to merge than here, which had McKinley Foundation,
Right.
Disciples Foundation, so that
Yep.
so that they were less likely, the congregation was less likely to want to see the foundations merge because there was a physical location
Yeah,
as well as
that's
just the
right.
concept. Because I didn't make that up.
No, you didn't make that up.
Okay, good.
The first foundations were created on this campus. There were no other campus ministries anywhere. So the denominations thought, that's a good idea. Partly they thought it was a good idea because private colleges, which the churches had all sponsored in the past, were declining. And state schools were growing. More disciple students were going to the University of Illinois than they were going to Eureka College, for example. And churches being churches, wanting to conserve the basic values of Christianity for the United States, thought, well, if we're going to affect the future generations, we got to get ourselves on those campuses, on those state campuses. So they created these things.
But some campus ministries didn't
Did
have
not,
buildings.
because there were no campus ministries there.
But they had ministries, but not a foundation.
If there were ministries, they were done ad hoc by congregations that happened to be close to those campuses.
It's just out of a church office.
Yeah, someplace.
Okay.
But just think of the millions of dollars that are invested by those 5 UCF bodies in property. And the endowments that they all told, these 5 units are mammoth.
So in some ways, the UCF here was doomed to failure from the start.
Well, not necessarily.
As far as if the goal was to be the merging thing, not necessarily not getting
Right.
mission accomplished, but as far as
It looked up until 68, actually until 71, that we were going to be able to do it. But 68 was a sign that all was not well. And I began to suspect, especially Wesley at that point, that Wesley was not, it was saying, yes, we're going to do this, but there was just something about the way that yes was said that made me think there's more to this than meets the ear. Actually, it was McKinley was the next pullout, and then it was clear that it was not going to work, not going to happen. And McKinley's reason for pulling out was that they had lost $300,000 the week before because of its constituency was not happy with its anti-Vietnam War stance. And McKinley was one of the outfits that had the most money to put in UCF, so it was clear that we were really damaged by that.
so. Back in '64, you're here for a little while now. So you're trying to reshape the board. A lot of your program energy is going into UCF though at this point. So most of the camp, and are you the only staff person?
And I was getting a lot of flack for that.
Getting flack for being the only staff person or flack for doing UCF
Flack for
stuff?
doing UCF stuff, because and when I had the interview, there were 7 or 8 students who were supposed to be the core group. And I guess they were the core group. And they talked about how they had hundreds of students in programs here. And after the first semester, it was clear that nearly all of those people who had been identified as core group graduated that spring, so they were gone.
That's never happened to us.
And there were only 3 or 4 who were left. That was Amos, Chenoweth, Linda Lodwig, Ron Caldwell, and David Brooks. Tom Nichols, and Tom Nelson. And they were pretty solid types, but we're only talking, less than 10 people. And while we did things together, we tried to do them not as the Disciple Student Fellowship, but we tried to do them as the United Christian Fellowship students on the north west corner of the campus. And the board members, the IDF board members weren't unhappy with that, but the congregation was unhappy with that. So we were catching some flack about that.
Because you weren't using the word disciple to attract people, you were.
That's right.
You weren't converting people.
We weren't converting, and we weren't getting too many people into church services on Sunday. Largely because we wanted everybody to go to the chapel service over on Pennsylvania Avenue. So that was going on. I drew up for the annual meeting a critique of the situation. This would have been in August of '64, and a proposal for dealing with it. Presented that to the board, the 40-some odd people. And basically the board split, 18 sort of in favor and the 27 definitely against.
Did you meet in this room?
Yeah. So the proposal was dead on arrival. But no directive was given as to what I should be doing, so I just kept doing what I was doing. And one of the things I was doing was we had a rotating board. 6 people came on, 6 people went off every year.
This is the UCF board.
No, this is IDF
The
board.
IDF board. Okay.
And a new group of the 27 had to be elected every year, so for the 18, I began to, well, no one wanted to serve on the nominating committee. Yay! So I became the nominating committee.
So you were stacking the deck.
That's what I was doing.
Just continue doing that for the next 30 years.
So I would nominate 3 students and 3 faculty people and for the new class. So I got 18 changed. The 27 was a different matter. Mental Littlejohn is a good, some of you remember Mental Littlejohn. So I've looked for people like Mental Littlejohn, who would be sympathetic with what we were doing, but who would be a little bit disturbed about, there's not very many disciples involved in this. The other thing was that we've been successful in creating the United Commission on Campus Christian Ministries in Illinois. Jim Prine was the head of it. And Jim got busy studying where disciple students went, where Baptist students went, where this group went, and what he is.
Is this the precursor to IMHE?
Yes. And what his study showed, it took him about 3 years to pull this together, but what it showed was very helpful. Namely, that less than 1% of disciple students came to the U of I. They went to other places.
Less than 1% nationwide or 1% statewide?
And statewide.
Where were they going?
They were going to places that were less research oriented and more vocational oriented. So they might go to, say, Carbondale for 2 years and then transfer in, but likely they would stay at Carbondale or Edwards.
Right.
So I was able to pull all that stuff together in this proposal and say, hey, there's just fewer disciples around now. So we gotta come up with a different direction. And the 18.
What year are we talking about again?
The 18 executives committee.
64.
That just sounds more.
Yeah, I know, it sounds-
The 18
History just keeps on
exec-
repeating
yeah,
itself.
The 18 executive committee members understood this, so I didn't have any problem with them. But it was the 27 that we were having problems with.
And did they rotate off to 27 at all?
No,
They were on for life.
no, they weren't. They had to be reelected by their districts if they stayed on. And that was an annual process, and
So when you
once,
say districts, you mean by the congregations in the districts?
yeah, like East Prairie Cluster
Okay, okay.
comes together and makes decisions, and so, but there were 27 districts.
At the time.
And the congregations would meet someplace.
What a structure that, I mean, they have the majority on the board no matter what.
Right. Well, this is where restructure, the denominations restructure helped. Because not only did they eliminate the national office for campus ministry, they didn't create one anywhere else. And the region decided in its restructuring that 27 districts were too many. So we're going to reduce it to 17. And then it got reduced even further into clusters. So this was an opportunity to rewrite the Constitution, IDF's Constitution, so we did. And we eliminated all that 27 stuff. So we're just talking about 18.
And of the 18, was there a requirement at that point that they had to be disciples?
No. Or did they have to be adults? That is, people above 30. So we began to pack more and more students into the board. But we had faculty and folk who were very close to the university because, like, some of them were plumbers who worked for the university.
So by the time this restructuring happened, is it 64 or 65?
No, 68 was when it was announced.
Took that long.
Oh, so it took a while, so this was a pattern.
It was 73 before we got everything stabilized here.
So along the way, and I know there's different benchmarks, but was the so as you were changing the board members, was there less and less representation from next door?
Yes,
By their choice or by our
by
choice?
my choice,
Okay.
by my choice.
Now we're getting down.
But I'm
Okay,
assuming
edit
there's less
minute
interest in the
57,
activities that
39 out of
IDF
the,
is doing, and
official.
therefore less suitable candidates for the board.
Well, this is jumping ahead, but there was a lot of explosion during the 70s from next door. The changes that occurred in the 60s caught up with us in the 70s. But that was true of, I mean, the backlash against higher education began, and as far as the state legislature was concerned in 1970, that was the first time the university got a big, healthy cut in its budget.
Because
and
it was just breeding resistance.
it was
and
breeding these dissident people. The Trilateral Commission, which Jimmy Carter headed up in 1976, also issued its statement about universities. The backlash was really fearful. We lost some of our UCF staff to that almost immediately after Martin Luther King's death. Larry Hill, Jim Ray, Nancy Stagg, and then shortly thereafter Phil Durant. These
Did you say Nancy Stagg?
Yeah.
Just the one who worked at WILL?
Yeah, she was on UCF staff through McKinley. Harry Applegate, Errol Rohr. Phil Durant and Errol Rohr probably deserved it. We had hired those guys. They were both, Phil had been in military, Army intelligence. Errol had been in Air Force intelligence. And we had hired them to infiltrate the underground units on campus that called themselves the Red Brigade. And they did a marvelous job. We knew exactly what the Red Brigade was going to do at any moment. And But because they were involved in Red Brigade activities, they had to in order to maintain credibility there. People began to see, well, look at these guys, they're the ones who are blowing up the Loomis lab. They're the ones tearing down the flag, blah, blah, blah. Phil, the banks closed him out. He had
Wait, so with the Red Brigade, what was?
It was a bunch of people who considered themselves to be red, and they called themselves a brigade.
But it wasn't like a Chicago Red Squad.
No.
No,
it
no,
was-
this is
This was
sounds like an
campus.
anarchist.
Yeah,
Like
sort of.
an ultra left formation.
They surfaced, I forget what year it was, but they gathered at the flagpole in front of the Union, took the flag down. The marshals had already been called out to maintain order on the campus, and so the marshals saw them taking the flag down and attacked them. They retreated down Matthews Avenue across the Boneyard and stopped on the north side of the bridge. The marshals pursued them and stopped on the south side of the bridge, and there was a standoff. I was standing.
What year was this? Yeah.
I don't remember what year.
Okay.
I'll ask my dad about
66, 67, somewhere in there. It was, the Wisconsin thing had already happened, so.
The math building.
Whenever that was.
Oh, the math building?
Whatever happened.
That was 1970.
No.
Oh, you're talking about the Dow Chemical stuff. 1967, when the
Okay.
Madison students were
That sounds
attacked.
about right. That
Yeah,
sounds about right.
fall of '67.
So I had heard the ruckus and was in the office and went rushing up Springfield and got to Matthews and could see what was happening, so I cut down there. And by that time, thousands of people had collected, and we were standing shoulder to shoulder. There was no way to move.
That's what we need to
We
do
were
in order
there.
to get people.
And on the other side were the marshals, and there weren't very many people standing on their side. So I would judge that most of the people were sympathetic to the Red Brigade at that point. And some idiot on the far side of the bridge lit a firecracker and threw it over, and it landed right behind us. And so we thought, man, the marshals are gonna start shooting now.
Like Haymarket.
Yeah, but they didn't. So it was a standoff, and after 3 or 4 hours, people got tired of standing and drifted off. The marshals were the last ones to leave.
Can I
So
take
these
us-
two people were, okay, they're UCF people, right? The two people that had infiltrated the Red Brigade.
Yeah.
And so they were known to be part of the Red Brigade, and they were also then recognized as UCF people, so
Yeah.
they were easily identified.
Yeah.
But their sole reason for being in the Red Brigade was infiltrate, not because of
Yeah,
their.
but of course, no one knew that, and we
Yeah.
couldn't tell that.
Right.
So I want to go back to '64. So the Freedom Summer stuff,
Okay.
because you went down for that stuff, right, with foundation people.
We had, well, SNCC had set a quota of 1,000 people, had to be down there every month. So, I don't know how it was divided up, but UCF was set its own figure of 300 people. We'd try to get 300 people down there a month, which was not easy to do. Everybody had to go through the training, and a lot of it occurred up on the 3rd floor in the room where the fireplace is, McBride Hall. And we'd get people in their cars, and we'd go to Carbondale. Everybody would sleep on the floor there at the Carbondale campus ministry, and then the bus would arrive and take everybody on down to Mississippi. Everybody on the staff, UCF staff, took a turn going down. Some stayed for 2 weeks. There was a 2-week tenure. There was a month tenure, and there was all summer. No one here went for the whole summer. It was a rough scene, and it wasn't for everybody. Plus we had the 3 people killed in Mississippi that year. Cheney, Goodman,
Schwerner.
yeah. Lots of people were arrested, both blacks and whites. The idea was to go in and work out of a particular county seat, find a place to stay, usually in some black family's home, at least to sleep. Go to, sometimes there would be an office, especially in Greensville, there was an office there. But in other places, there was no office, you had the office on your back, and you would go to house, try to get people to register, to volunteer to go to the courthouse to register. Some would volunteer to do that, most would say no. Some would say, well, I'll go if you go with me, so that was the process. We came back, our groups were just really beaten up bad. Billy Jackson Morrow was a big help to us because he had painted a whole series of paintings on civil rights situations in the U.S. They were kind of like Cabas, who am I thinking of?
Norman Rockwell.
No. Kerniga, that painting, when the Germans bombed.
Okay.
They were like those kinds of paintings. And then we had these therapy sessions in this room where we would go through and paintings were hung on the wall. And then we'd go through and talk about what we saw in these paintings and what we had experienced.
Was he down there too?
No.
No.
No. He was, that's not to say he wasn't somewhere, but he was.
But not part of the UCF
He was
group.
not in that. So, and you got some of those hanging in the CCHCC building. the office.
Well, the one he did for a healthcare one, yeah.
So they're all like that.
Mhm.
Then we'd take those paintings and we would go out, we'd wrangle speeches in different churches around the state and take those paintings and go out and show them and say, well, this is how I found this to be. And we'd talk about that image in a painting.
So how much time did you spend down there, Jim?
I was there for a week, which was a week too long.
You have one particular story or one particular memory
Well,
from
the
that time?
thing that always bothered me most was we had on one group that went down, the women they weren't all arrested, but there were 6 women and 3 men who were arrested. The women were taken to the county jail. All of them were taken to the county jail. And the women were put in a cell block with a lot of local rednecks, and they were raped that evening. Men were placed in another cell, and they were brutally beaten. And then the processing was of going through the legal process of booking was not fun. Had to go up in this old courthouse, kind of Romanesque style courthouse. Had this big winding marble staircase going up to where we were processed. And there were police about every 4 or 5 steps on the stairs, and as you'd go by, they'd whack you in the back of the legs with their billy clubs. And that's not fun. So, and people found out, you can't depend upon police, you cannot depend upon people who work the law to respect human rights. So when you get into this kind of stuff, you'd better be prepared to face that.
So did the trips from down here, the people who went and came back, did it radicalize, traumatize, burn out? I mean, what was the result afterwards for the work that was happening here?
Well, it did all of those. The 60s are noted for their radical ways, but I would guess that on this campus, most of the people kept their noses in their books. There were only a small percentage of the folk who were actually doing the radical stuff.
I mean, of the people that were mobilized through the UCF?
Here, I don't know what happened in the other, well, I know what they've said, but here, participation increased.
Because with those people sticking around, or because of people hearing about what those people went through?
I think both. People who had gone through it were more credible. They seemed to be more ready for whatever comes next. And they were enthusiastic about it, and people caught that and came. There was nothing magic about it. It was the same types that those who had gone through it, the ones who came were the same types that they had been before they'd gone through it. So it was kind of a growing process. And it had a lot to do with involving yourself in something, and then you became excited about it, and you were able to convey that excitement to somebody else. Another thing that was going on at the same time was the Ecumenical Institute in Chicago, which was committed at that time to doing social justice change in metropolitan areas. And it had devised a method for doing social analysis, for making group decisions on action projects, and was in fact being hired by various metropolitan areas to help them deal with housing problems, for example. Even the city of Tokyo set up a contract with them to do one for the city of Tokyo. So the Ecumenical Institute was helping us down here generate kind of an intellectual way of theorizing about social change. And so we were sending a lot of people up every weekend to the 3-day course thing that the Ecumenical Institute did. It was housed in an old Roman Catholic nunnery up there, Oak Park somewhere.
It's a good way to scare them away, huh?
It was a neat old place, and I met Bill Maud.
Was that Rosary College?
Could be, I don't remember the name, but he was there at one weekend. And I had gotten used to his drawings, cartoons and things, so it was fun meeting him. And
What was his role there? What was he doing?
he was taking the class. He was taking the course. I don't know what he was going to do with it.
Was this tied in with any of the Alinsky stuff at all, or was this?
Linsky would occasionally plug in, or it was not his outfit.
Okay.
And during that time, were there any people from the congregation involved in the actual activities? Like this stuff?
Everybody who was on the board of 18, the executive committee of the Foundation 18, were also members of Uniplace.
Okay.
But they went to Uniplace after they served on the board. One exception was Clyde Smith. Clyde came to the board, foundation board, through the congregation.
Did any of the board members go down south? Or was it just the student members?
I want to say Lance Johansson did, but I'm not sure.
So at this point, I imagine that was fairly traumatic when people came back from the Freedom Summer stuff. And was the board supportive? And then how was the congregation supportive, or they just think the IDF was getting too wacky at that point doing that, or?
I don't remember when it occurred, but there was, or that is what year, but there was one year in which I was not permitted to preach sermons at the Uniplace politics, whether it was that year or not, I don't know. But it was early on. In fact, they hired a speech therapist from the university to work with me. Because I was pretty blown away.
I heard a speech therapist to work with you. What was that
Work on
supposed to do?
like pronunciation or your topics?
Just speaking,
Because after that.
yeah.
Hmm.
We were all in pretty bad shape.
Oh, I mean,
Okay.
Okay.
but it wasn't because of the content of what you were saying.
I have no idea.
Oh, okay.
All I know is one Sunday I was told, we've hired this guy and he's going to work with you. So, Al Gully was his name. He was on the board of the YM.
So civil rights stuff was pretty much then occupying most of UCF and energy at that point.
Yeah.
Besides doing some theoretical stuff, it sounds like, and doing.
Also about that same time was when we discovered there were only 33 blacks on campus. So Project 500, our COPS, was created as a result of that fiasco. And that was largely due to UCF. UCF was the one who heard about it. I mean, the blacks went public about it, so Howard said, this is something we ought to address, so we started dealing with it. And also Governor Kerner got into the act. He hired William K. Williams, who later became board chair of UCF, and to be his ombudsman on campus, answerable only to the governor, and he was given the order to integrate the university. So he did. Well, he tried. He fired a bunch of people, and Project 500 got started. University decided it had to get busy and actually recruit blacks, so but it recruited blacks on the same basis that it recruited whites, which was at that time to get one white person here you recruit 3. So they went out and recruited. They wanted, I forget what the exact number of blacks they wanted, but they ended up recruiting every black that they recruited came. So they came. There was 500 of them. And there wasn't any room. They didn't have enough dormitory space. Didn't have
And
enough
this
scholarship
is
money.
68, right?
Somewhere, no, it was before 68.
Well, 68 is when they first arrived on campus.
No, it came very soon.
That was Project
No,
500.
because
There
it
was
just celebrated
precursors.
its
But Project 500.
anniversary like last year.
No, but there was precursors to Project 500.
Right.
I mean, it started almost the next year after it went public,
Hmm.
the program. And they didn't have enough money, so reconciliation got created, I forget what year it got created. Anyway, we wrote a grant, got $10,000 to give to the university for scholarship assistance. And the university wouldn't accept it because it came from a religious body. So Gene Graham, who was a professor of journalism in the journalism department, we laundered it through his bank account. And the university took it.
Okay, edit 1 hour and 18 minutes, 40 seconds to figure out which parts we're going to edit for the official history, Jim. Money laundering.
That's
So, well, yeah, you did all those things.
So, let me jump back again. So we had civil rights.
Going back.
Well, no, because we jumped forward to 68. I want to jump back to like. So when did so we were talking about? I'm just trying to establish the chronology. So we have board stuff. We've talked about relationship stuff, UCF, civil rights. So when did anti-Vietnam War stuff come into play?
Okay, Johnson sent in, Joe, help me out here, I sent in a bunch, this was before the big numbers of U.S. military combat
He sent
troops.
the first combat troops in March of '65.
Okay, so it would have been that year. Clergy and laity concerned about Vietnam had been started, Bill Coffin and some others up in New York. And that spread rapidly throughout the country, and I think probably that fall we had started our own chapter here. It was in UCF. So it started out with different kinds of petitions and protests on the quad.
So UCF was pretty clear early on that this was something they had to protest.
Yeah, yeah. I think largely.
Well, early on being a relative thing, I guess, but.
Well, we were all aware about Vietnam long before that year. My first touch was in 1954. And then again in late 50s. The early maneuvering that the Kennedy administration did, it was, that was getting around. People knew about that. So it was no big jump.
So by the time it came done, there was no real debate
there wasn't
within
any. No,
UCF.
there was no debate about it within UCF.
What was going on, just maybe kind of connect this, what was happening on this campus around the election in '64? Is there anything that you guys were working on in terms of like candidate support or anything like that?
Well, if there was candidate support, religious bodies don't give candidate
I
support.
understand.
It certainly wasn't for
But
no one.
you also don't launder money.
No, I suspect that UCF was registering, that was another thing that was going on, registration of students to vote. And I think that was probably the time when we were able to get student registration on campus for the first time.
Yeah, but they still had to be 21.
Yeah, but there are students here who are 21.
Right, I understand.
So all of that was, going on. I mean, I call this the tyranny of the moment. Things are happening so fast that you haven't got time to think about any of them. You just respond as best you can.
You're talking about that whole time period.
Yeah, that whole time, because things were, it was hectic. You really didn't have time to think. You were going on instincts, basically. At least I was relying on instincts a lot. So.
So 65, you guys, UCF starts doing
Anti-war
stuff.
The Free Speech Center thing was a big chunk of that. The university didn't want any speechifying occurring. Belden Fields got himself arrested sometime in that period, and then banned from making public speeches for 3 years.
That's when you ran off to France.
Yeah, I guess so, whenever that was. And the free speech center, the debate was about, it was going to be located on the south east corner of the patio on the back of the Union. And boy, the university did not want it there. So there were demonstrations every day at noon for months, it seemed like, before we finally got it. And then people could go to and a little lectern was built, made out of concrete. I don't know if it's still there.
No, they tore it down a few years ago.
Mm.
They tore it down.
So,
The whole quad is free speech zone now.
yeah, it's supposed to be. So people would, line up. There would, be 30 or 40 people lined up to make a speech during the noon
I
hour.
think when they redid Harker Hall, they tore it down.
Free Speech Center. So, and a lot of those speeches were anti-war speeches. The College of Higher Ed got involved. Jack Easley was the dean of the College of Higher Ed. And so after a couple of years of lobbying, we got 3 days set aside in the university calendar in which no classes would be held, and there would be sit-ins all over the place, and people would talk about the war. So that was a part of the activity. Then there was a program called Light Up the Winter, which was in the winter months. And we'd have classes on Vietnam history, what was going on, that kind of stuff. We also had the selective counseling center set up. That would two students from the grad students from the law school helped to set that up and trained all the folk to be counselors. There were 27 counselors trained. So there were a lot of people applying for CO status because they didn't want to be drafted. Largely, I think, was they weren't all conscientious objectors, is what I'm saying. They just didn't want to be drafted and sent to Vietnam, which was valid from our point of view. And we were pretty successful at that. We lost cases with local boards and regional boards, but we never lost a case that went to the national board.
So how much stuff was happening in this building versus at the UCF building versus other places? Was it all just kind of happening all the time at all
This was
places?
happening nearly everywhere.
So some teaching stuff was happening here too.
Yeah, yeah, there were no distinctions in UCF between the entities. It would depend more on, like, if we wanted to offer a course that was located close to those people who lived on the north side. And so if that was the case, we were the site. If it was going to be located over on the Six-Pack side, it would be McKinley. If it was, it'd be Wesley or whatever. So the decisions are made like that.
But there were so many things happening that there was a lot of events
Oh,
still
yeah,
going on.
yes, yes. The building started to be used, well, when I first came, there was hardly anything took place in this building, except on Sunday. And, but by 67, 68, but it was pretty, everything was being used except the third floor. And occasionally something would take place up there, like the nonviolent training stuff.
Well, do you want to take, I'm almost out of tape on this one, take a short break and then do another, I don't know, how far do you want, was your plan on going today, Jim?
I didn't really have a timeline then.
Okay.
Where do we end up?
So let's go till 3, we can end it there?
Yeah, just take a short break.
Yeah. People can stretch and.
But I will add.
So now we're back to where? We're back to the anti-war stuff. We're kind of,
Yeah, we were talking about like the selective counseling center and.
I guess we're back to the mid-60s and all the activity that was happening at the foundation and UCF, anti-war stuff. So besides, so we're kind of tracing the 60s. We see civil rights stuff, we see anti-war stuff. I liked your phrase, tyranny of the moment. But so what other things were going on? I mean, we talked about also the some of the theoretical stuff going on up in Chicago and coming back. But was there time for any other activities? Were they pretty much subsumed by civil rights and anti-war stuff at this time, or was the foundation or UCF doing any other things?
Any Bible study?
Yes, there were Bible studies, and there was fundraising duties.
So you still had to keep all that stuff?
All that stuff had to be kept going.
So the Bible study, were you doing that? Was it?
Mm-hmm.
So what shape was it at that point?
There were a bunch of different shapes. One of the things that there seemed to be a total lack of information about was social and historical critiquing of biblical texts. So that's where we started, was developing the tools for doing that.
Were you calling it just Bible study at that point, or was it?
No, we'd
Neighborhood watch,
pick
or
up
was it-
particular texts, and that'd be the title of it.
who's the we? Who was involved in this?
At the beginning, it was, Tom Hieronymus was a board member, and he considered himself to be an atheist. And so we didn't have a Bible study that first semester, that fall of '63. So I asked Tom to teach that Bible study, which surprised him. But he did a very good job of it. I forget what book it was he taught, but he picked an Old Testament text and went with it. And the students, mostly students in his class, got a big kick out of it. So that was a good beginning. And then I think we did a New Testament text. I did a New Testament text the next semester. Tom then got foul of the preacher next door and left, so I lost my atheist teacher. But we kept those things going. And there was what we call Sunday seminars, which were different faculty people recruited to come in on a Sunday morning at between the two services and share with the students whatever they had to share. Some civil rights, some war stuff, economic stuff. We did, I took a group back to Youngstown for an economic study of the steel industry or a city in which the steel industry was closing and what was happening to the people there. So those kinds of things were going on constantly. At least that's my impression, looking back on it. So there was a lot of theoretical stuff still. I mean, it wasn't just coming from Chicago, it was, we were doing some of it here too.
So were there, I guess I'm just trying, were there any other program type things or things that were popping up at that, I mean, not saying there wasn't enough going on, I'm just.
Yeah. Churches out around the state, where congregations out throughout Illinois would call and say, well, can you come preach for us this Sunday or that Sunday? And so those things were scheduled in. Not because I wanted to, but it was a way of keeping congregations throughout the state aware of what the foundation was and its need for money. So there's very few places in Illinois that I haven't probably been. Then there was all this furniture. We had to get furniture. So fortunately, Bill Jewsbury was a member of the board, and he owned an outfit called No Name Incorporated. I don't know what that company did besides sell furniture, but he sold furniture. So all of the stuff that's like this, and the desks in the office, and all the chairs down in Weisgarber, and
I couldn't pick a different color.
and then chapel we bought through Bill. Putting in the windows in the chapel. The church.
So the chapel got completed in the mid-60s?
Then the church had an explosion in its pipe organ, so the foundation put $30,000 into rebuilding the pipe organ in the sanctuary.
Is this the Red Brigade?
Oh.
Was that the last time they replaced it? It was like the $200,000.
No.
I just remember reading about it recently. That's why.
No, they've redone it
Since
then. But all the pipes on the north wall are the ones that the foundation bought. So I've always reminded them that those are our pipes.
What about the, not remembering clearly, but the van service,
The neighborhood service ministry.
That was later.
that was much later then, okay.
Started in '73.
Okay, so I'm gonna,
But well, before, since that didn't work out.
Okay.
Sorry.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about the anti-war stuff.
that's how it's gonna go too.
And the fact that the foundation became a sanctuary and things, kind of some of the stuff you talked about in class for us a few weeks back. how did that play out? How
Well, once the National Guard came to town,
And the,
And
the
when
year
was this?
was,
I think must 68, 69, somewhere there. The Illinois Commandant was in charge of Champaign-Urbana in the University of Illinois. He was the boss, which did not make the two mayors happy, and I'm sure the president of the university wasn't happy.
Basically martial law.
That's right. So, and there was a curfew announced, everybody.
this was in response to what? Just a series of protests or escalating protests?
Oh, there were, it seemed like months, there was a big march on Green Street between Wright and 4th Street. And all the windows in all of the stores, especially Fowlet's, would be broken out. So,
Just because people were chanting so loud, right?
yeah, probably.
Vibration.
Fowlet's especially lost its windows every time. And finally they got to where they just boarded up the whole place. And so there weren't any windows to break out anymore. So I suppose it was something like that.
But so it was more a series of events than one specific
Yeah, I think so.
really big
The
bad thing.
campus was pretty tense. Plus we had folk coming in from outside who were angry about the university not controlling its student body. So they were gonna do it. So it was not just the campus. In fact, I think campus was the least of the concern. But that's my opinion. Anyway, people had to be off the streets by 5 o'clock. It was my recollection. That seems early now, but I think that's right. So, and of course, that's not going to happen. The law-abiding folk will probably get off the streets, but not everybody. So UCF decided we need some sanctuary sites. So Wesley was one, McKinley was one, and IDF was one. McKinley was set up to also be a legal sanctuary. We would put lawyers from the law school in there who would help people deal with their legal problems. Wesley was cited as the medical aid center. So people who got hurt were taken there. The reason for that was that the place was so crowded with rioters or demonstrators that ambulances couldn't get through. So healthcare providers would put people on stretchers and carry them to Wesley, and the ambulance would take them from there. And we were a place for people fleeing north from the trouble area. So the board said, yeah, our board said yes, McKinley board said yes, Wesley board said yes. So those were our sanctuary sites. And for quite a while, we did that. Up through the 70s, we were sanctuary sites in that sense.
Meaning that after 5 o'clock, people, if they were out, they'd run in here and
They'd
hang
come
out,
here,
or if
yeah.
cops ran after people during the day, they could run in here and.
Police would be stopped. We would meet the police at the door and say, you can't come in. Without a warrant anyway, you can't come in. So if they could get here, they'd be okay. But we had some rules. Once you got here, you had to stay all night. And that meant I had to stay all night, so. We got a lot of Army cots from the campus supply store.
So how many hours a day were you working at this point, Jim?
It was nearly
30.
all the time. Which did not make home life very interesting at times. But
And you were living, where was your house at this point?
it was at 810 West Illinois. Urbana.
Was that a IDF house? IDF owned that?
IDF owned it.
Was it just a residence, kind of like a parsonage thing?
Yeah.
And Dolores was working at the library already at this point?
Yeah. She started work about a year after we got here.
So I'm sure you maybe told some of these stories in Joe's class. But I know I'm remembering stories from other times, but talking about machine gun nests on the different parts of the street and stuff like that.
Well, this was probably in the 70s,
Okay.
early spring.
So it's a different guard occupation. Post
Well,
Kent
the guard
State.
was here. So things were getting,
After
more-
Kent State probably, you know.
well,
or
Kent State
early
was
70s.
in May and Jackson State was a few weeks later. So things were building. Everybody was now aware, I think, that free speech was a myth. And that redress of grievances was a myth. Peaceable assembly was a myth. Articles 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 are a myth of the Constitution, amendments. So we were headed for some kind of confrontation because the authorities all believed those myths. Well, on the big night, Dan Perino, who was located somewhere in the Dean of Students, or maybe he was even the Dean of Students at that time, I don't remember. But he was in the Dean of Students office. Dan is the founder of the Medicare 7, 8, or 9, that band, jazz band unit.
Which is officially retired about 5 times in the last few years.
Yeah. So he had contacted UCF and said, "You got to help us." So he asked us to be on the streets, walking the streets with him, helping if students get in trouble because the curfew was still in force.
So the UCF ministers or just UCF members?
Just UCF staff and any members that were willing, board members that were willing to get out. I don't remember any board member ever going out, but all the staff did. So there was going to be this big rally on the quad, and Dan wanted us all there. He wanted us to wear our clerical garb. So I put on my clerical collar, stomped out of the house and crossed over Lincoln Avenue and noticed that, gee whiz, there's a National Guard machine gun nest set up in the middle of Illinois street, sandbagged all around, and with 3 soldiers there. Went on in.
It's Illinois and Wright, or?
Illinois and Lincoln. There's Illinois and Lincoln, yeah. There was also same thing on up the street, 2 or 3 blocks. Ran into some patrols, squads, 7 people. Went on into the quad and the place was jam-packed. Police estimated that around 10,000 people were there. The head of where the biggest mass was up by the Follingers, and then it spread out towards the Union. And the mass of people went all the way back to just about where that final triangle that splits and goes into where the patio is. There were a few bodies back behind that, but not many. So it was all jammed up towards Fallinger. Frank Reed, who was a Roman Catholic priest, which very few people knew. He was also a grad student. He had been defrocked because he had married a nun, and the Pope didn't agree with that, so.
They tend to frown on that.
Frown on that. So, but he had been elected president of the Graduate Student Association, and was one of the campus leaders. And he was giving a speech, and the Red Brigade folk didn't like him. They knew he was a priest. And they were, I was about 3/4 of the way back, and they were about even with me at that point, over to my right. And they started yelling, "Kill the priest, kill the priest." And I had my clerical collar on, so I quickly took it off.
Wise decision.
And they began to muscle their way up towards the front of the crowd. And they finally got to the flagpole and pulled the flag down, set it on fire, and pulled it back up. And Frank got back to the mic and said, "Is this the kind of demonstration that we want to have or not. And the mass of humanity gave this really strange animal-like guttural sound, which was a negative. And they just closed in and squeezed the Red Brigade until it popped out the rear.
Still including your two underground people in there?
Yeah.
They were still.
So then somebody got to the mic and said the National Guard is moving in. So the crowd just began to spread out and scatter. And it took 10,000 people a long time to get out of there, but it was clear that they were scared of the National Guard. So I started back to the house after most everybody had left. The staff people all gathered and talked a little bit, kind of figured out what the next day would be, and then left. And on the way back, I began to notice how these machine gun nests were situated. The muzzle of the machine gun was pointing away from campus. It was not pointing into campus. So I got thinking, that's strange. And the next day we found out why. A group of Phyllis Schlafly's muscle men from Alton had come to campus. They were driving around campus in trucks, pickups, and any student they came close to, or as close as they could get, they would try to hit them in the head with chains, big heavy chains. So we had some students who were badly injured.
Was Phyllis swinging some chain, or was she?
I don't know. So then the next day, the brigade had gotten its act together, and they had already made their plans that they were going to charge the armory, because the armory was where the ROTC headquarters were. And the commandant, of course, had figured that out too. So he had pulled all the ROTC people together and had handed out the rifles and gave them live ammunition. So he was determined that the armory was not to be taken.
So he had them stationed at the armory with the live ammunition to protect it.
Yeah. And the Red Brigade and its crew, there were thousands of them, were on the north end of the quad and were getting ready to march on the armory, going up the street there from the library. So Howard Dolphinbaugh, I knew the commandant of the ROTC, so my job was to talk to him. Howard's was to work with Errol Rohr and work with the Red Brigade. So I got the commandant to agree that if he would break his troops down into squad level, would they be willing to sit down that afternoon and talk with an equal number of students about the war. And he said he was ready to do that. He would be willing to do that, but he was prepared to stop any attempt to take over the armory. So I got the word back to Howard, and Howard got it to Errol, and Errol did his negotiation within the Red Brigade, and they decided they didn't want to be shot. So, march
Good decision.
ended.
It's part of that decade of decision.
Yeah, that's part of the decade of decision. So that evening, we had these meetings all over the floor of the armory. As people talked to the...
How was that organized? Was it just like equal number of ROTC people and equal number of students?
Yeah.
Was there anybody facilitating it, or was it just like a free-flowing
I suppose the
discussion?
squad leader was, and the commandant was patrolling, and Howard, and, well, there were the core group of the staff were there. So we were all patrolling just to make sure that nothing got out of hand.
So no campus police presence, or?
I don't remember seeing any. In fact, after the guard moved in, I don't remember seeing any campus
Yeah,
police, period.
Yeah, they probably all went on vacation.
Yeah. The guard was what you saw. Before that was the marshals.
How did those discussions work out? I mean, what?
They worked out, well, there was no resolution, of course, but they were peaceable discussions. And different groups, of course, weighted it one way and saw it another way, but seemed to be a genuine dialogue going on. And certainly no violence occurred. The 2 city mayors received awards from the FBI as a result of all this, so that was good.
And they were there, obviously, right?
Yeah, we never saw them. Well, we actually knew where they were. They were on the 3rd floor of the library in a suite of rooms up there where they could, it was high enough so that they could see the quad and the White Wright Street, that's where they had set up their command post. But as far as actually seeing their bodies out on the quad, no, I never saw them. They may have been there, but I didn't see them.
Well, so I have a structural question. I mean, I know SDS was active here, and I'm sure there was a lot of other groups going on. So the people who were within the UCF and IDF who were members, like the students who were members, were they also part of these other groups? And so how were things structured? How was their? I mean, I know
there was no structure.
There was no structure.
Yes, there were people who were in both groupings, all groupings. But there was no official structure between them.
The groups are pretty fluid at that point. I mean,
Yeah.
SDS wasn't really ever a national
They
organization.
did ask us to do some workshops for them when they had one of their national meetings down here. I forget what year it was.
Was that the Channing Murray, I think?
But it was during the Christmas break period. We had Christmas break periods in those days. And it was at the Union. And we had workshops in the various rooms of the Union. The one thing that I remember that seemed significant to me was that there was a break between, there was a split in SDS between the men and the women. Because the women had pulled off into their own workshops. They did not participate in any of the workshops that men participated in. They did gather out on the south patio to smoke cigarettes or whatever.
The women or the men?
The men and the women.
Oh, okay.
And they would compare notes, et cetera, but for the formal teach-ins, they were separate. So there was something going on there in that session.
Well, part of the reason, I guess I was asking about structure, I know things, were loose, but how many things, I know there were so many events going on, but how many things would IDF or UCF say, hey, let's us have a rally, let's have our rally tomorrow, or let's have our teach in it, or how many we're gonna go support this? I mean, I guess how many things were generated by the foundation or UCF at that point?
Well, we did our things on the south patio of the Union on a fairly regular basis. I suspect we were out there once a month.
So rallies?
Yeah, and speechifying.
But these were events that were sponsored
by
UCF.
We did the 3-day sit-in thing, but no classes were held. That was ours. And that took a lot of work to get that done, but we got it done.
So there were events that were being specifically organized
Mhm.
by the foundation as well. I don't know, we might be at a break point.
Yeah, probably.
We might want to pick up, so we've kind of, not the whole 60s, but we've captured a lot of the
Kind of
60s.
pick up right toward the end of the war, next time maybe. 'Cause when I came here in '72, the war was still going on. There were still huge rallies taking place in Lincoln Hall Theater and in Fullinger and stuff like that. So that was right at the tail end of
Yeah.
all of these things.
And my impression is that those were not as intense.
No,
as
because
the
things
earlier stuff
had
was.
wound down quite a bit.
Yeah. And plus, that may have been because UCF was collapsing at that time too, and they weren't into it.
Well, let's kind of pick up at 70 next time, kind of
Yeah.
the ending of things, and we can look at some of the same elements. Because I think we've got some key elements as we go through this phase now.
What decade will it be? Last one was decade of change.
Oh, it's decade.
Or
Decade of
decade of
decision.
decision.
One other
Next one
thing
will be a
that
decade
actually-
of confusion.
that's important in my mind, which gives you an idea of Uniplace's position. Rafe Miller was the pastor when this occurred. I don't remember what year it was. It was after the first big demonstration that was on campus, and it was in the spring. But the elders of the congregation called a special meeting in which Rafe Miller and I were charged with starting riots on campus. I had been in Indianapolis the day of the so-called riot, so the charge was easy to defeat. I wasn't in town.
Well, they didn't say, we want you to go start some riots. That wasn't the charge they gave, but they were
No, they were
accusing you.
They were being accused of starting riots. Rafe had a different problem because he was in town. And I forget how he explained his, but we weren't making any headway. Fortunately, Tom Morgan, who was the university's security chief at the time, was a member of UniPlace. So Rafe suggested, let's call Tom in for another meeting, and he can explain what's going on. So we had another meeting with the elders, and Tom explained that no, Rafe and Jim were not instigating riots, and they weren't inciting riots. He agreed that there were riots.
So Channing Murray was never part of UCF?
So this one little elder,
They were around.
Floyd Locke was his name, a little bitty skinny guy, stood up next to me and shook his finger in my face and said, I want you to know this congregation is a Republican congregation. It always has been a Republican congregation, and it will always be a Republican. So that
clear.
was the congregation's attitude.
So obviously this is when Nixon was in office then.
Yeah, I'm sure it was.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up, so I'm seeing a few things to focus on. So we can look at foundation structure and, as we progress now into foundation structure, board, congregation relation to the foundation's activities, program work.
The neighborhood service ministry.
Well, UCF stuff. I mean, I guess just as, the program work, UCF stuff, as that stuff starts to develop.
IOMG.
Pardon?
IOMG.
But other things that, so kind of looking at some of the basic streams to talk about. And then all Jim's free time that he had in all this period.
Yeah, right. And I think, as I was talking with Jeff on the way over here, the beginnings of the food co-op,
Yeah,
You know,
that happened in the 70s.
the origin of that,
Right.
and the principles and goals and stuff like that. Because I think particularly now that's important for us to get this down.
Well, that'll be next. Well, speaking of next, I'm gonna stop this now. Wait, I'm not stopping it then. So what I want you to do, Jim, is stuff that you bought, hold up first,
No.
or give to me. We're not done yet. We're not officially done yet.
This is just stuff that's important to me. We covered some of this last time. This is the little church at Quinlan,
Yeah.
Oklahoma.
So I'm gonna scan it in.
Was that
This is what in Oklahoma?
Quinlan, Oklahoma?
Oh, it's from last time.
The place that had no road.
Yeah, the place that had no road, plus 2 of the worship bulletins. Pass those around.
For those of you who weren't here, you'll have to tune in to episode 2.
I'm waiting.
And then this was a postcard photo of the church in Youngstown. And this is Bill Jewsbury and his wife, and Dolores and me, and the guy who helped us buy furniture for the foundation. This was a picture taken in '67.
And here's a close-up of some of the furniture of the foundation.
Piece of
Still,
furniture.
still here. There it is. Look at that.
There's a photo of Reverend Hayes and Ruth Webster of Hot Springs, Arkansas.
Boy, Jim, this brings back memories. This is the same kind of stuff we used to produce out in the chaplain's office on board
right,
ship.
right.
They all look the same.
Everybody wants to be the first Christian? Come with the first Christian
You
church.
never hear about the second Christian church, third Christian church.
Well, the first Christians all got killed off, so that's graduation from seminary.
Wow, this February 57.
And that's our wedding day.
That is a big dress.
Wait, did that dress just kind of take up the entire
Yeah,
area?
yeah, I kept stepping on it. One of the things that UCF was able to do with Uniplace was that we were able to get Mr. Garvey, who had a jazz band started here.
John, yeah.
John Harvey.
And they did a jazz mass, they composed the jazz mass for us. So we pulled this off, and this was the jazz band as they were performing.
His son Frank became a member of the Young Socialist Alliance when I was the organizer on campus here in
Well,
the
John,
70s.
John's still alive, but not really very conscious. He's out in
Yeah.
Florida or whatever.
Frank, I think, went out to California. So.
This is a
Wait, Jim, is this your wedding?
Wedding day.
Yeah, that's Reverend Jarman. These are photos of all the first generation students,
Wow.
the core group.
You can just pass the whole folder over if you want.
And the budget of IDF, when I started, was $17,000.
They have a present US
$94.
flag at the church, huh?
We're working to get back there.
And my
We
salary.
pay that in power alone right now, I think.
And my
A month.
salary was $6,000.
And that was an increase from Youngstown, right?
That was an increase for us.
That's Cecil Bridgewater.
I wouldn't have recognized
That is, that's Cecil Bridgewater.
I believe you.
Who's playing in town, who played in town last night.
Yep, he did.
Yeah.
Here's the series of correspondence the foundation sent me as they were trying to con me into coming.
Well, I bet you I could forget who the rest of this band is too, but that's Cecil for sure. That's Cecil for sure, with the big fro.
Plus, I think there's a job description in there.
Oh, I can use that to send in.
There you go.
I'm just gonna copy it, send it in. One thing would have a difference.
And this is the constitution that existed at that time.
Oh, you dug deep this time, Jim.
Like, stickers. Jokes.
And then that's the outline of my critique after the first year. With proposals on the last page.
What room is this, Jim?
That was over at the parsonage.
Oh, okay.
That was one of our first meetings with the cabinet, student cabinet.
So the parsonage, that's where you lived then, that was your...
Mhm.
They didn't tear that down till 80s?
2 years ago.
A few years ago?
So, it was a neat old house.
I mean, that's where you lived until you moved into your current house, right?
21 years.
So these were all...
That was the core group that I was introduced to for the interview. Most of them were gone by the next fall, so. Some of them, Amos and Linda, of course, stay in touch, but the parishes stay in touch. And Caldwell stays in touch, so that group is
on typing
still
paper.
remembered.
Carbon, we're gonna
All right, well, I think I just wanted to get the